Hello, my name is Riley Tidingfong. I'm a doctoral student in the Department of Communication at UC San Diego, and I'm here with Christopher Preston, who is a professor of environmental philosophy at the University of Montana. And so we're going to have a conversation about our work today and kind of engaging in similar themes across both of our bodies of work. So starting with you, Christopher, maybe you could say a little more to introduce yourself and just talk about how your work is engaging questions of the environment.
Sure. So I'm an environmental ethicist. That means, broadly speaking, I work on questions about the human relationship to the surrounding world. I've been particularly interested recently in emerging technologies because it seems to me that the kinds of technologies that are coming online now, various areas of biotechnology, nanotechnology, climate engineering, these are technologies that set us in a completely different relationship to the surrounding world. And we don't want to let this happen kind of surreptitiously and not notice it. We want to be fully aware of it. So that's where my work digs in right now.
Great. And you've described us as sort of entering into an epoch or a moment that you've called the synthetic age. Can you say a little bit more about what that is and kind of why people should care about this?
Yeah, that's right. So the synthetic age is the idea that what we have the capacity to do now is to get under the surface of the way the Earth works and really change its metabolism, really sort of alter the basic functioning of the world. And so if you think about biotechnology, we can alter the way genomes are constructed. We can alter the way that organisms function out in wild nature, really based on what we've done in a lab. And so for me, this really stands us on the cusp of turning nature into something else. And I call it the synthetic age, just as a sort of a red flag warning that we're entering into a different kind of a time. So Riley, I know your work touches on technology and its impact on the world and the dramatic changes that are happening. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. So I'm thinking a lot these days about kind of processes of governance and public engagement and just questions about how we can get communities who are going to be impacted by some of the technologies that you describe to really have a say in how they're going to be deployed, where they're going to be deployed. So I'm asking broad questions about how we can do that, particularly for underrepresented communities who may have not had a say historically about technologies implemented on their lands or that might be affecting their bodies.
Yeah. Is there a sense that this is now more urgent or more important than it's ever been before?
Hmm. I definitely think it's always been important. I think that we're sort of in this moment of more intentional collective grappling with questions given sort of the unprecedented nature of some of these technologies. My current project is looking at the ethics of the emerging genetic engineering technology gene drive. And I think we are at this precarious moment with regard to the climate crisis and sort of all these interconnected issues arising, as a result of a warming climate. And there are things that a gene drive could do certainly to intervene in those issues. So I think there's a lot of collective attention on the potential promise of these technologies, as well as the risks. So I think we're at a kind of unique moment in terms of asking these questions about who should really have a seat at the table to be weighing in on, whether these technologies are safe to deploy in the field.
So I worked a little bit on gene drive. For me, what matters about gene drive is that you're sending out a lab design technique into the wild world. I mean, it was one thing when you could do stuff in the lab and you could, perhaps use that technology in a very controlled type of situation. But with a gene drive, what you do is you make an alteration into the genome of an organism and then you send it out there to breed. And so that change gets propagated into the wild world. And so for me, this is a massive change for what we think of as the concept of nature. So tell me, in your work, gene drive obviously takes on particular significance. Maybe you can outline that a little bit.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Gene drive is sort of unprecedented in the way that it can engineer changes on these broad and, in some cases, self-propagating scales. So what's interesting, as you said, in this challenge or kind of questions about bringing this from the lab to the field is how to do that safely. And one thing that comes up a lot is sort of a presumption that so-called isolated environments or geographies would be the ideal place to do that, to sort of, contain the effects of early trials of a gene drive modified organism, like a mosquito or a rodent. So I'm looking at this, tension between the fact that there could be important uses for a technology like gene drive on islands, right? Certain islands I look at throughout Oceania and have, relationships to as a result of my own personal genealogy. We do have issues of things like vector-borne disease. So maybe a gene drive could help suppress populations of mosquitoes that vector diseases to humans or even to important endemic bird species, right? Gene drives have also been talked about for use to engineer coral reef resilience. So lots of interesting potential applications. But at the same time, there's sort of more of a top-down conversation coming from some of these key governing bodies and organizations that publish guidance frameworks about how to safely bring gene drive to the field, wherein the presumption is that islands would be a good place to do early trials of gene drive, so that we could try and maybe contain the risks right before release in more continental geographies. So I'm looking at that with a critical eye, given the histories through which indigenous lands and islands throughout the Pacific have been used for other types of experimentation that have had adverse effects like nuclear testing and things like that.
So what is the best way to do that work justly and fairly?
I think just getting us to engage in these governance discussions, more questions about justice and sort of the distribution of risk and benefit, thinking globally. I think a lot of the sort of agencies that are tasked with, deciding if a gene drive should be released are thinking more about, is it safe and does it do what it's supposed to do, right? Safety and efficacy. But I would love to see those agencies engaging more in questions of justice and thinking about, for instance, the distribution of risk and benefit, sort of in terms of these historic and ongoing geospatial politics that mean that we export risk to some areas and not others, right? And so, Christopher, in your work, are you asking questions, also thinking about governance or processes of decision making that might be sort of unique to the synthetic age?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the heart of the synthetic age is that these technologies are different, that they're more powerful. And so with more powerful technologies, it becomes especially urgent if you are going to proceed to do it in a just and inclusive kind of a fashion. And as you point out, the track record is that that's not how things have gone. And so when you have technologies that are getting developed in labs at MIT or in London or in San Diego, and then you're talking about deploying them in places like sub-Saharan Africa or on Pacific islands, there's sort of a built-in risk there that a repeat of colonial types of patterns is going to happen again. And so thankfully, one of the things that I think some of the developers of these technologies have recognized right from the beginning is that there's ethics written all through these technological developments. These are not developments that should come straight out of the lab and get deployed in an environment. There are ethical considerations about governance, about fair deployment, that just demand a more inclusive type of approach than we've had in the past.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I'd be interested to hear more about what you think might be some of the inclusive processes that could better guide this decision making. There's all this conversation around public and stakeholder engagement. I think there's a lot of room for sort of rich debate about what that could look like or the limitations of what it looks like now. But do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, these are multidisciplinary processes. And, I put myself in the ethics category, and the social scientists whose job it is to figure out these sorts of fair and just types of engagements. But we had a project here at the University of Montana where we were looking at climate engineering and the deployment of climate engineering in vulnerable communities where people are already experiencing the risks from climate change. So we had a student go to the Arctic, Pacific Islands, and sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the interesting results there was we were sort of, I was at least suspecting that there would be resistance to these technologies as just being too much of an interference with the natural world. There wasn't that much resistance to the technologies themselves. In fact, because people were already experiencing the impacts of climate change, in general, across the different research sites, there was enthusiasm to do something about it. Mm. But whatever was done about it, the people who were interviewed insisted that there was some sort of local determination over how that technology was developed and deployed. It wasn't going to be enough to get a technology off the shelf from MIT and just trust somebody else to manage it. There had to be some sort of local involvement. And that was really sort of a surprise, like the openness of the technology was a surprise. And then the sort of insistence on some local determination, that wasn't such a surprise, but it was a sobering reminder, I think, to the developers of those technologies.
Right. Yeah, I feel like I found similar things in regions where I've been asking these questions and engaging with community stakeholders. It seems, I think, coming from developers or folks that I might talk to at UCSD who are sort of stakeholders in the realm of the technology development, I think there is this assumption that communities are going to have a lot of pushback. Often a part of that assumption is also that there's just sort of a lack of education or knowledge around genetics or around genetic engineering, or sort of fear or skepticism, right? So, and not to say we don't run into those things, or that I don't run into those things with communities I talk to, but I think similar to what you're saying, overwhelmingly the themes that do come through are more about self-determination and sovereignty, particularly in Pacific Islander communities where there are sort of, rich grassroots activist efforts to get Indigenous land back, or to at least be able to determine, the uses of Indigenous lands. I think often the conversation is less fear of the technology and fear of exploitation, right? And a really understandable fear and resistance to exploitation.
Yeah, one of the challenges I've seen at work, which I'd be interested in what you find here, is many of the people developing the technologies are well aware of these justice kinds of issues. But at the same time, they're very bought into thinking that this technology is going to be helpful. So for example, if you were developing a gene drive that is designed to suppress mosquito populations in order to reduce malaria, you would be coming into your work utterly convinced that anybody thinking about their own interest is going to love this technology. But that's not always the case. It's not always the case that something that looks so unimpeachable from the developer's perspective is going to be welcomed from the perspective of those who will end up having these gene-driven mosquitoes on their land. So have you found, is there any effective way to actually kind of bridge that potential gap between the enthusiasm of the developer and the hesitancy of those who are going to be subjected to a technology like that?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think one thing I struggle with this is that we're sort of, at least in my experience, we're engaging communities or initiating engagement activities with communities already assuming that a gene drive would be the solution to pursue, right? I look a lot in my work at community-based participatory approaches to research, these traditions of more grassroots involvement of communities in sort of iteratively shaping what research even looks like, or what the research question even is, right? So traditionally, this approach to research, having come out of more like social sciences and education and sort of some political movements around the world to get communities who are impacted by research to sort of, designate what that research even looks like, there's an interest in applying that here because there's, recognition that communities should weigh in on gene drive, but there's sort of a misalignment with that approach and, the sort of predetermined decision that gene drive should even be the topic of conversation. Does that make sense? So it feels like, to me, a better way to do this would be to be bridging some of these different stakeholder communities, developers, scientists, community stakeholders, regulators, about the issue that we're trying to solve. The fact that the coral reefs are degrading because of our warming and acidifying ocean, the fact that we have these neglected tropical diseases, vectored by different organisms. I think if we started from the issue and had sort of like a broader menu of solutions, we might get closer to what looks like a more inclusive or community empowered process, right? Rather than coming in and sort of starting from within the framework of, or the world of gene drive.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, actually. It's very tempting. Like, if you put a lot of your energy and your dollars into developing technology, it's very tempting to present that technology as plan A. This is where we need to turn. But, perhaps, especially with technologies that are particularly intrusive into the way the natural world works, so climate engineering, gene drives are examples of those. Especially with those technologies, you might better think of it as maybe plan D, E, or F. And so think about what are the other things that you should be doing. And if you're thinking, let's say, about gene drive to control malaria, malaria is a public health issue. So what other public health considerations should you be looking at first? What should you be funding first that is less risky, that might have significant benefits, before you put gene drive at the top of the menu? And it definitely is encouraging to me when the developers of such technologies recognize that their technology doesn't have to be plan A. If you're doing plan A, B, C, and D already, then okay, it's all right to have that technology in the sort of backup set of tools, but don't put it up there at the front.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So maybe now, in starting to transition towards wrapping up our conversation today, could you maybe talk a little bit about where you're headed in the next year, 5 years, thinking about some of these questions, or maybe other projects you might have on the horizon?
Sure, yeah. The problem is when you get into something as powerful and as interesting as some of these biotechnologies you've been talking about, the issues just explode very quickly into 1,000 other issues. I'll tell you where I've sort of been going, where my thinking has been going. This idea of the synthetic age suggested that we were moving into a world that was more and more built, more and more managed, more and more controlled at all sorts of different levels. But my impression is that despite these technologies, the world that we're moving into is in fact potentially less and less controlled, more and more unpredictable. There's a sense in which the deeper the technology goes, the more surprises you can have. And so some people use the word Anthropocene to describe the age we're entering, the human age, the age where more and more elements of the world are managed by human decisions. And I started thinking that if this is the Anthropocene, it's going to be a pretty wild ride. So I used to use this catchphrase, getting ready for a wild Anthropocene. And it's going to be wild because the technologies are going to enter into areas that come with risks. It's going to be wild because the societies into which these technologies are going to be deployed, and the societies who are developing the technologies, those societies seem to be subject to more and more vagaries and more unpredictabilities because of the way that social media is changing how we govern ourselves, how politics works. So you've got technologies that come with risks. You've got societies that come with perhaps new ways of moving socially through problems. And so I've been looking at this idea of a wild Anthropocene. If I can just add one more little piece there, one of the features of this wild Anthropocene is a growing interest in rewilding. So I'm from Europe originally, and if you look at where the environmental movement is going in Europe, there's a lot of interest in bringing wildlife back onto landscapes that are depopulating, where people are moving out, certain parts of the economy are fading and other parts of the economy are rising. And so literally wildness is returning in these parts of Europe, which is, to me, is sort of remarkable. We're in the Anthropocene, but wildness is returning. So this idea of a wild Anthropocene is really captivating me at the moment. I'm writing a book at the moment on rewilding and wildlife and what that's going to do to change the human relationship to nature. So that's kind of where I'm heading. It's a lot of fun. And you know, the issues I think are important. But anyway, tell me where you're going now with your work.
Oh, so I'm hopefully graduating from my doctoral program in a few months from now. So getting a PhD is where I'm most immediately headed. I'm hoping to continue engaging in this space, thinking about gene drive governance. I think, as I said earlier, you know, what's sort of exciting is that we are, in our attempt to grapple with the unprecedented nature of these technologies, we're sort of finally asking questions I think we always should have been asking about how to do research in more just ways, how to involve communities in ways that empower their expertise to inform decision making. So I think I'd love to stay engaged in this space, and I think these types of ethical questions we're being prompted to ask and think about together can inform a lot of other realms of research and technology development as well. So my hope is for now that I can kind of, you know, stay in this gene drive world, thinking about indigenous governance, thinking about what it could look like to have more kind of stakeholder driven decision making as we figure out if it's going to be safe enough to bring something like this to the field. And then my hope is that beyond that, I can keep bringing those questions to bear on other types of technology that impacts indigenous lands.
You encouraged that things are heading in the right direction?
I think I have a healthy amount of skepticism. I think I'm always encouraged by the work of communities and the knowledge and expertise of communities who know their history and, you know, have a sense of the need for more authority and governance to protect their sovereignty. So I always have hope in that. I think some of my sort of healthy skepticism of it is more squarely in just the way we're thinking about engagement within academia and within some of these scientific spaces, just because I think there's sort of in sometimes mostly I think well-meaning attempts to think about how to do something more participatory to make these tough decisions, fields that don't really have the long history of using that kind of approach to research might default to sort of more conventional ideas about whose expertise matters in this space, right? Or wanting to sort of just do this unidirectional, let's educate communities so that they'll be more amenable to accepting the technology. So I'm encouraged that there's more conversation, I think, pushing back on like these deficit models of engagement and saying, you know, if we want to do engagement, let's do something that actually is participatory and actually works with communities to respect their knowledge and their sort of situated expertise. So I'm hopeful with a little bit of skepticism for some of the language that we embrace that makes us feel warm and fuzzy, right? Like we're doing inclusive engagement. So I'm keeping an eye on that for sure.
Yeah, it's hard to do. It's easy to say, but hard to actually do.
Exactly.
But the advantage of having people coming at this from slightly different directions is enormous. I mean, for me, these technologies are so powerful that they have to be interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. They have to have the humanities involved. They have to have people sort of jumping in there and raising difficult questions about ethics and about justice and about inclusion. So, you know, to some extent, I have some optimism that that's happening a little bit now. in a way that it might not have happened so much before. So that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, I agree. I think I feel, really privileged to be in a lot of spaces where I get to hear from people who have totally different takes on some of these questions and who have totally different expertise. I really, being at UC San Diego, I really appreciate, my proximity to a lot of the developers who work on this, as well as, philosophers and ethicists like yourself who are grounded in really interesting ways of looking at this. So I am encouraged about, our sort of collective power to grapple with this across all of our knowledge areas.
Yeah. Well, this has been fun, Riley. It's good to know you're working on this stuff, and hopefully our paths will keep crossing. So thanks for the time.
Thank you.